Episode 1. The Man Who Episode 1. The Man Who Copied the Entire History of Soviet Intelligence. The KGB's Inner Secrets and the Man Who Preserved Them. It is hard to grasp how much the West did not know during the long decades of the Cold War. Analysts in intelligence agencies believed they had a basic map of how the Soviet security services operated. They knew the structure. They knew the ideology. They had defectors and scattered fragments of evidence. But they were building conclusions from thin material. The Kremlin was a closed world. Moscow's internal archives were beyond reach. The KGB revealed nothing. Its officers rarely defected. Most of its failures were hidden. Most of its successes were buried. The West understood only the outline of the threat. The substance remained sealed behind layers of secrecy. This began to change because of one man. He did not look like a spy. He did not behave like a dissident. He lived an ordinary life on the surface. He went to work. He walked the same streets every day. He kept his head down. But inside the Soviet Union's most secret archive, he was doing something extraordinary. He was copying the entire history of Soviet intelligence. He was doing it slowly, page by page, across many years. He was doing it alone. He was doing it while surrounded by the very system he intended to expose. His name was Vasili Mitrokhin. His job placed him inside the files of the KGB's first chief directorate, the division responsible for foreign operations. These were not routine files. These were the core records of Soviet intelligence activity abroad. They included reports from deep cover agents, assessments of foreign leaders, plans for active measures, technical records of covert actions, internal evaluations of success and failure, information on the KGB's recruitment strategies, names of moles inside Western governments, notes on how the Soviet Union shaped foreign media, files on penetrations of ministries, embassies, political parties, and trade unions across the world. These were the most sensitive documents in the Soviet system. Mitrokhin handled them because he was trusted. He was an archivist. His task was to maintain the records. His supervisors saw him as quiet and dependable. They assumed he was loyal. They assumed he was insignificant. They assumed wrong. Over time, he became deeply disillusioned with the Soviet system. He watched how senior officers behaved. He saw how the institution treated its own people. He saw the hypocrisy. He saw the corruption. He watched as the KGB claimed to defend socialism while it drained resources from ordinary citizens. He watched as officials misused power and justified everything in the name of the state. This shaped his decision. He did not act out of sudden anger. He acted because he believed the system was betraying its own ideals. He believed the truth would someday matter, and he knew the truth was inside the archives. He began to take notes. At first, the notes were small, short summaries, key facts. Then he expanded the scope. He copied entire pages. He created a parallel archive. He hid the material in his home. He stored boxes underground. He moved the notes in ways that avoided suspicion. He worked for years, knowing discovery would mean imprisonment or death. What makes his story remarkable is not only the scale of what he copied, but the method. He was not feeding intelligence to foreign services while living in the USSR. He was not making contact with the West. He was not using dead drops. He was not traveling abroad. He acted with long-term intent. He wanted the archive preserved until the time came when he could escape. This strategy made his work far more dangerous, but also far more complete. No Western agent recruited him. No operation controlled him. The archive was his alone. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the moment finally came. He approached Western intelligence. He offered what he had stored for decades. The first reaction was disbelief. No one expected an archivist, living an obscure life, to bring out a trove of documents larger than anything the CIA or MI6 had ever obtained from inside the KGB. But the material was real. It was consistent. It was detailed. It contained insights that matched known operations and revealed unknown ones. It was the most significant intelligence windfall of the post-war era. Mitrokhin's archive reshaped how historians and analysts understood the Soviet security state. The files did more than list operations. They showed the thinking behind them. They revealed the assumptions of the KGB's leadership. They exposed the gap between propaganda and internal reality. They documented failures the KGB never admitted. They documented successes the West never suspected. They showed the long reach of Soviet influence campaigns. They traced the KGB's recruitment networks. They explained how disinformation traveled. They exposed secret funding routes. They detailed covert action in regions where the Soviet role had been guessed but never proven. The archive showed that the Cold War was not only a geopolitical contest, it was an intelligence struggle at every level. The KGB invested heavily in foreign penetration. It placed officers in embassies. It ran illegals under deep cover. It infiltrated political movements. It used journalists and academics as sources. It shaped narratives abroad. It framed events to advance Soviet interests. The West suspected much of this. But the archive provided the evidence. It documented the methods. It gave names. It gave dates. It mapped the networks. To understand how the KGB reached this level of influence, we have to look back to its origins. The roots were in the early Bolshevik period. After the revolution in 1917, Lenin created the Cheka. The Cheka was designed to secure the new regime. It fought counter-revolution. It controlled dissent. It monitored the population. It created systems of surveillance. It justified extreme measures. It developed habits that would persist for decades. The Cheka became the GPU. The GPU became the OGPU. The OGPU merged into the NKVD. After World War II, the NKVD became the MGB. In 1954, the MGB evolved into the KGB. Each transformation changed the structure, but the mindset remained constant. The security services were the shield of the state. They protected the revolution. They controlled the population. They confronted enemies abroad. This long history shaped how the KGB approached foreign intelligence. It believed ideology guided the world. It believed Western nations sought to weaken socialism. It believed deception was a normal tool of statecraft. It believed the Soviet Union had to fight for its survival in the realm of information. This produced an intelligence service with an unusual mix of mission and paranoia. The KGB saw threats everywhere. Some threats were real. Many were imagined. But the belief in global struggle never weakened. The Mitrokhin material shows how deeply this belief affected operations. Even minor events were interpreted through ideological frameworks. A political shift in a foreign country, a labor strike, a student movement, a diplomatic dispute, a journalistic article. Each event was examined for hidden meaning. The KGB assumed hostile influence. It assumed foreign subversion. It assumed Western intelligence services were constantly active. This worldview shaped recruitment strategies. It shaped disinformation campaigns. It shaped how they evaluated foreign leaders. The early post-war period was a turning point. The Soviet Union expanded its influence across Eastern Europe. Satellite states were established. Security services in those nations were modeled on Soviet designs. The KGB supervised them. It trained personnel. It monitored political activity. It integrated intelligence operations across the region. This created a large network capable of coordinated operations. The West watched from a distance and understood only part of what was happening. The Mitrokhin Archive reveals the scale. It shows how each state contributed to the larger mission. It shows how lines of authority worked. It shows how dissent was policed. It shows how the KGB used its allies for operations abroad. By the 1950s and 60s, the KGB expanded further. It built networks in Western Europe. It developed relationships with political groups. It attempted to influence debates on nuclear policy. It worked to weaken NATO unity. It supported peace movements when those movements aligned with Soviet goals. It used front organizations. It used cultural exchanges. It used academic conferences. It used publishing houses. It used trade unions. It used everything available. The archive provides the internal reasoning behind these efforts. It shows which operations succeeded. It shows which failed. It shows how the KGB evaluated Western counterintelligence services. Mitrokhin's access allowed him to trace these developments in detail. He worked inside a building where the most secret records were stored. He handled files that revealed decades of covert struggle. Over time, he came to believe the KGB was losing its moral direction. He watched as the agency justified almost any method. He saw the gap between public claims and internal reality grow wider. He began to write faster. He copied more material. He hid more boxes. He kept going even when he feared discovery. His archive became a personal mission. When historians finally examined his notes, they found a pattern across the decades. The KGB combined ideological rigidity with bureaucratic ambition. It believed it was shaping history. It believed it was defending the future. But many decisions were shaped by fear. Fear of dissent, fear of foreign influence, fear of internal collapse. The archive reveals these contradictions. It shows an institution that projected strength but worried constantly about its own vulnerabilities. Understanding this tension is essential. It explains why the KGB devoted so much effort to monitoring Western nations. It explains why they created large networks of agents. It explains why they invested heavily in disinformation. They believed information could decide the Cold War. They believed narratives could weaken opponents. They believed the West underestimated them. They believed they were acting in defense of global socialism. This first block sets the foundation. It introduces the archive. It explains its value. It provides the historical background that shaped Soviet intelligence. It opens the door to the Cold War struggle that dominated the second half of the 20th century. The Cold War moved into its most formative years in the late 1940s and early 1950s. The Soviet Union emerged from World War II with enormous losses but with expanded influence. Eastern Europe fell under Moscow's control. The Red Army occupied territory from the Baltic to the Balkans. New governments aligned with the Soviet model were installed. Security services modeled on Soviet structures took root in Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. Each of these states developed its own intelligence arm, but each remained tied to Moscow through training, doctrine, and long-term oversight. The KGB stood at the center of these networks. This created an intelligence sphere that was larger and more integrated than most Western analysts realized at the time. The Soviet bloc could collect information across multiple regions. It could monitor internal dissent. It could manage political opposition. It could influence internal policy in each satellite state. It could coordinate foreign operations that crossed borders. The archival material shows these activities in detail. It shows how operations in one country supported operations in another. It shows how information moved between capitals. It shows how officers communicated through secure channels. It shows how the KGB used the Warsaw Pact nations to test new methods and expand reach. The United States and its allies responded by building new intelligence capabilities. Agencies expanded, budgets increased, new personnel were hired. The Cold War became an intelligence-driven conflict. Both sides collected as much information as possible. Both sides attempted to shape events abroad. Both sides sought to recruit agents inside each other's governments. Both sides attempted to understand the other's intentions. But the Soviet approach differed from the Western model. The KGB combined ideological goals with a culture of secrecy. It preferred long-term infiltration over short-term influence. It valued patience. It believed ideological pressure could shift political systems. It believed Western governments were vulnerable to internal division. Mitrokhin's archive reveals how the KGB ranked foreign targets. The United States was considered the primary adversary. Britain was seen as a close partner of the United States. West Germany was seen as a crucial battleground. France was important because of its political instability. Italy was seen as fertile ground because of its large communist movement. Scandinavian nations were considered useful for monitoring NATO and Western technology. Nations in Asia, Africa, and Latin America were targeted because of their strategic value and their political volatility. The KGB assigned officers to embassies around the world. They operated under diplomatic cover. Many were part of the First Chief Directorate. Some served as legal officers known to the host country. Others served as illegals with new identities. These illegals were difficult to detect. They were trained to blend into foreign societies. They used forged documents. They posed as citizens of other nations. They built networks of contacts. They stayed in place for many years. Some rose to positions of influence. The archive includes files on their missions, training, and support structures. Recruitment was central to Soviet strategy. The KGB recruited sources for information, influence, and access. Some recruits were motivated by ideology. Some were motivated by personal grievance. Some were motivated by financial need. The KGB evaluated potential recruits carefully. It studied their backgrounds. It assessed their weaknesses. It assessed their ambitions. The archive includes detailed files on recruitment methods. It shows how officers identified targets. It shows how they approached them. It shows the training materials used to shape these relationships. During the early Cold War, the KGB used ideological alignment as a key recruitment tool. Many individuals in Western democracies sympathized with socialist ideas. Some admired the Soviet struggle against fascism. Others believed the Soviet Union offered an alternative to capitalism. The KGB used this environment to find people who might cooperate. Some cooperated willingly. Some cooperated without realizing they were aiding a foreign South. The archive shows how officers cultivated such relationships and how they exploited the idealism of young activists. The KGB also invested heavily in disinformation. It created false narratives. It forged documents. It shaped news coverage. It planted stories in foreign newspapers. It used front organizations to influence public opinion. Disinformation campaigns were not random. They were designed to weaken Western confidence. They were designed to create doubt about Western institutions. They were designed to shift debates on nuclear policy, foreign intervention, and civil rights. The archive describes these operations in detail. It explains their intended effects. It records internal assessments of their impact. Active measures became a central part of Soviet foreign strategy. These measures included propaganda, political manipulation, and covert support of friendly groups. They were used to destabilize governments. They were used to disrupt alliances. They were used to influence elections. The KGB believed active measures could shift global power without direct military action. They believed Western nations were divided internally. They believed those divisions could be widened. The archive contains extensive material on active measures. It shows how they were planned. It shows how they were coordinated across multiple countries. It shows how the KGB evaluated success. The early Cold War also saw a shift in Soviet leadership. After Stalin's death, the Soviet system entered a period of internal struggle. Power shifted among senior figures. Nikita Khrushchev eventually emerged as the dominant leader. He criticized Stalin's abuses. He sought to change aspects of Soviet policy. But the security services remained powerful. The KGB adapted to the new environment. It maintained its core mission. It continued to focus on foreign operations. It continued to monitor internal dissent. It continued to act as the guardian of the Soviet system. Khrushchev's policies created new challenges for the KGB. He attempted to reform elements of the Soviet system. He promoted a more optimistic vision of the future. He encouraged cultural exchanges with the West. He increased contact with foreign nations. These changes created new opportunities for Western intelligence. They also created anxiety within the KGB. More foreign visitors entered the country. More Soviet citizens traveled abroad. More cultural events occurred. The KGB had to monitor all of these activities. The archive describes the strain these reforms placed on the organization. The KGB believed that ideological contamination was a threat. It believed foreign ideas could weaken socialism. It believed Western culture could spread dissent. It believed open contact created vulnerabilities. The archive records how the KGB monitored artists, writers, scientists, and students. It watched for signs of political deviation. It kept files on conversations, friendships, and travel. It tracked any behavior that seemed suspicious. The KGB believed it had to defend the Soviet population from external influence. At the same time, foreign operations grew more complex. The world was divided into blocs. Proxy conflicts began. Intelligence agencies played major roles in these conflicts. The KGB supported revolutionary movements. It provided training. It provided funding. It provided weapons. It provided intelligence. It attempted to shape political outcomes. The archive details these operations. It shows the reasoning behind them. It shows the challenges officers faced. It shows the failures and successes. The Cold War entered a nuclear phase. Both sides developed weapons of unprecedented destruction. Intelligence became more important. Each side needed to know the other's capabilities. Each side needed to understand the other's intentions. Each side feared a surprise attack. The KGB invested heavily in monitoring Western military activity. It recruited sources inside defense ministries. It gathered information on nuclear strategy. It tracked technological developments. The archive includes material on these efforts. It shows how the KGB attempted to understand Western strategy. This period also saw major penetrations of Western governments. Some individuals provided the Soviet Union with classified information. These penetrations shook Western intelligence services when they were discovered. They created doubt. They created mistrust. They exposed weaknesses in security procedures. The archive includes files on these penetrations. It includes assessments of their value. It includes details on how information was used. It includes evaluations of the risks involved. The KGB viewed intelligence as a long-term investment. It believed small advantages could accumulate over time. It believed persistent pressure could shift global dynamics. It believed information was power. Mitrokhin's work reflects this belief. The archive preserves decades of evidence. It shows how the KGB acted. It shows what it valued. It shows how it viewed the world. It shows how it prepared for conflict. It shows how it responded to challenges. As the Cold War developed, the Soviet Union faced difficulties. Economic problems increased. Leadership stability changed. Ideological confidence weakened. The KGB adjusted. It became more involved in domestic affairs. It monitored more citizens. It watched for dissent. It tracked religious activity. It tracked national movements. It tracked intellectual circles. The archive documents this expansion of surveillance. It shows how the KGB reacted to internal pressure. Mitrokhin copied these records across many years. He saw the evolution of operations. He saw how officers justified actions. He saw how political directives shaped intelligence priorities. He saw how fear influenced decision-making. He saw how the KGB struggled to maintain control. His archive captures these changes. It provides a clear view into a system that hid everything from public view. The internal structure of the KGB became more complex as the Cold War progressed. Each department had specific responsibilities. Some handled foreign intelligence. Some handled counterintelligence. Some dealt with scientific and technical information. Some monitored communications. Some watched dissidents. Some supervised border security. Others worked on active measures. The archive shows how these departments interacted. It also shows the tensions inside the organization. Bureaucratic rivalry influenced many decisions. Career advancement shaped internal behavior. Officers sometimes exaggerated threats to justify budgets and promotions. These dynamics created distortions that affected Soviet intelligence assessments. One of the most important departments was the First Chief Directorate. It handled foreign operations. It managed embassies abroad. It supervised illegals. It coordinated information from agents. This directorate had broad reach. It conducted espionage across the world. It monitored Western governments. It targeted NATO. It assessed foreign economic policy. It tracked technology development. It studied political movements. Mitrokhin handled many of his records. His archive captures the scope of his activities. It reveals the focus areas. It reveals the internal debates. It reveals the challenges officers faced. It reveals the disconnect between field realities and leadership expectations. Counterintelligence was another core responsibility. The KGB considered foreign penetration a constant danger. It watched Soviet citizens for signs of disloyalty. It monitored foreigners traveling inside the Soviet Union. It reviewed correspondence. It listened to phone conversations. It examined personal associations. The archive documents these activities. It describes how officers evaluated individuals. It shows the methods used to identify suspicious behavior. It reveals the criteria for surveillance. Western intelligence agencies were a major concern. The KGB believed that the CIA, MI6, and other services attempted to penetrate the Soviet system at every opportunity. It believed foreign services recruited diplomats, students, scientists, and military officers. It believed cultural exchanges were used for intelligence purposes. It believed foreign journalists collected sensitive information. This belief shaped counterintelligence strategy. The archive includes records of cases where the KGB intercepted foreign attempts. It includes instructions for detecting recruitment efforts. It includes descriptions of defensive operations. The KGB also watched Soviet citizens traveling abroad. It believed foreign influence could weaken residents. It believed individuals might be approached by Western services. It believed foreign travel placed ideological pressure on citizens. The archive shows how travelers were monitored. It describes briefings they received before departing. It details the reports they had to submit upon return. Officers evaluated these reports for inconsistencies. They looked for signs of manipulation. They looked for signs of unauthorized contact. They looked for signs of ideological deviation. Another major focus was scientific and technological intelligence. The Soviet Union viewed technology as essential to national security. It believed Western nations held advantages in areas such as electronics, computing, aviation, energy, and weapons development. The KGB attempted to close these gaps. It recruited scientists. It targeted research institutions. It infiltrated companies. It used industrial espionage to obtain designs. It used academic networks to gather information. The archive contains extensive material on these efforts. It shows the planning. It shows the execution. It shows the internal assessments of success. Some operations achieved significant results. Others failed. Some produced misleading information. In certain cases, Soviet scientists spent years working from flawed or incomplete data. The archive reveals how these errors occurred. It shows the consequences. It shows how internal criticism was handled. It shows how failures were sometimes concealed to protect careers. These details expose the limitations of the Soviet system. They reveal the impact of political pressure on scientific progress. The KGB also played a role in internal political control. It monitored dissidents. It monitored religious groups. It monitored ethnic minorities. It monitored intellectual circles. It monitored underground publications. It monitored conversations in universities. The archive describes how the KGB evaluated these groups. It shows how they categorized risk. It shows how they handled dissent. It shows how officers responded to public unrest. Many dissidents believed the KGB operated with absolute efficiency. They believed everything was monitored. They believed the system was impossible to evade. Mitrokhin's material challenges this perception. It shows that the KGB was powerful but not all-seeing. It made mistakes. It misinterpreted information. It overlooked important signals. It reacted slowly to some developments. It often relied on inaccurate reports from informants. The archive provides a more realistic view of its capabilities. It reveals the human side of intelligence. It reveals the limitations of bureaucracy. Despite these limitations, the KGB remained effective in many areas. It maintained control over political life inside the Soviet Union. It prevented large-scale opposition. It disrupted foreign intelligence operations. It influenced events abroad. It protected Soviet borders. It managed sensitive information. It provided the leadership with assessments of global developments. These assessments shaped Soviet policy. They influenced military decisions. They guided diplomatic strategy. They helped define the Soviet worldview. Foreign penetration of the West was one of the KGB's greatest priorities. It invested heavily in this mission. Some operations lasted decades. Some penetrations reached high levels. The archive includes material on these cases. It describes the internal reactions. It shows how officers evaluated the strategic value of each penetration. It shows the tension between the desire for more information and the risk of exposure. One of the most important forms of penetration involved ideological recruitment. Individuals inside Western governments or institutions sometimes supported socialist ideals. They believed the Soviet Union represented a global movement for social justice. They viewed Western policies with skepticism. The KGB attempted to find such individuals. It attempted to guide their actions. It attempted to build long-term relationships. The archive reveals how these relationships developed. It shows the internal debates about the value of ideological recruits. Financial motivations also played a role. Some individuals cooperated for money. They provided documents. They provided insider knowledge. They offered insights into political decisions. The archive contains files on these sources. It shows how officers evaluated their reliability. It shows how payments were made. It shows how risks were managed. It shows how failures occurred when individuals became compromised or changed their minds. One important aspect of the KGB's foreign work involved the use of front organizations. These groups operated in various countries. Some promoted peace. Some promoted cultural exchange. Some promoted political causes. They appeared independent. They appeared local. But they received guidance from Moscow. They received funding. They received messages shaped by Soviet policy. The archive reveals how these organizations were used. It reveals their objectives. It reveals the coordination behind them. Western intelligence agencies often underestimated the depth of these networks. They understood the existence of front groups, but they did not always see how information flowed inside them. They did not always see how messaging was coordinated. They did not always see how the KGB used subtle influence instead of direct control. Mitrokhin's material shows the inner workings of these networks. It shows how they contributed to active measures. It shows how they shaped public debate in foreign nations. The KGB also targeted international institutions. It targeted the United Nations. It targeted humanitarian organizations. It targeted scientific bodies. It targeted trade organizations. Penetrating these institutions offered access to information. It offered influence over policy. It offered insight into global trends. The archive contains material on these efforts. It reveals the reasoning behind them. It reveals the challenges officers faced. It reveals the results they achieved. Throughout the Cold War, the Soviet leadership relied on the KGB for guidance. The agency produced reports on global events. It provided analyses of Western politics. It explained trends. It predicted outcomes. It evaluated risks. Some assessments were accurate. Others were flawed. Political pressure influenced conclusions. Ideological expectations shaped interpretations. The archive shows how these internal assessments were produced. It shows the gaps between information and decision-making. Mitrokhin copied these assessments. He preserved the internal debates. He preserved the contradictions. He preserved the errors. His archive provides a rare look at the Soviet leadership's perception of the world. It reveals how decisions were made. It reveals what information influenced policy. It reveals how intelligence shaped diplomacy. It reveals how misjudgments occurred. As the Cold War continued, the KGB expanded its operations in developing nations. It supported revolutionary movements in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. It offered training. It offered funding. It offered intelligence. These operations aimed to shift global alignments. They aimed to weaken Western influence. They aimed to build alliances. The archive details these efforts. It shows how officers assessed local conditions. It shows how they managed relationships. It shows how they adapted strategy. Some operations achieved limited success. Others created long-term complications. The archive reveals the internal reflections on these outcomes. It shows where the KGB overestimated its influence. It shows where it misunderstood local dynamics. It shows where ideological assumptions distorted analysis. It shows how the Soviet Union sometimes invested resources in movements with limited strategic value. Mitrokhin's work documents these complexities without interpretation. He copied the material as it existed. He preserved the official perspective. He preserved the internal evaluations. He preserved the raw files. This gives historians a rare opportunity. They can examine the Soviet system from its own viewpoint. They can compare internal claims to actual results. They can evaluate decisions with the benefit of hindsight. The Cold War entered a new phase in the late 1950s and 1960s. The competition between the superpowers intensified. Space exploration, nuclear arms, and global influence became major battlegrounds. Intelligence services on both sides expanded. Technology advanced. Communications became faster. The stakes became higher. The KGB adapted to these changes. It expanded its technical capabilities. It increased foreign operations. It monitored global developments closely. One of the most significant challenges for the KGB during this period was understanding Western nuclear strategy. The Soviet leadership believed the United States held a strategic advantage. It invested heavily in intelligence collection. It gathered information on missile systems. It tracked bomber fleets. It monitored naval movements. It attempted to understand the logic behind Western deterrence. Officers analyzed speeches. They studied defense documents. They examined military exercises. Mitrokhin's archive includes assessments of these efforts. It shows how the KGB tried to piece together the Western strategy of nuclear dominance. The archive also reveals how the KGB viewed Western political stability. Officers studied elections. They studied party platforms. They studied voter behavior. They tracked public opinion. They analyzed social tensions. They looked for signs of decline or division. The Soviet leadership believed Western societies were vulnerable. They saw inequality. They saw racial tension. They saw protests. They saw political polarization. The KGB attempted to exploit these weaknesses. It believed active measures could widen existing divisions. It believed disinformation could influence debates. It believed political groups could be guided in subtle ways. Many of these efforts were recorded in internal reports. Officers described their missions. They described the individuals they contacted. They described the results. Some reports praised successes. Others warned of difficulties. Some highlighted the risks of exposure. Mitrokhin copied these reports. He preserved the internal evaluations. He preserved the language officers used. He preserved the structure of operations. His archive contains the most detailed picture of Soviet political influence abroad. This period also saw the rise of major technological challenges. The Western world advanced rapidly in computing and electronics. The KGB feared falling behind. It expanded scientific and technical intelligence operations. It recruited engineers. It infiltrated companies. It acquired blueprints. It obtained prototypes. It studied Western research. The archive shows how these efforts were organized. It shows how officers communicated with scientists. It shows how technology was analyzed. It shows the difficulties the Soviets faced in replicating foreign designs. Some foreign technology was difficult to reproduce because the Soviet industrial base lacked certain components. Some designs required materials the USSR did not manufacture. Some required advanced engineering that Soviet factories could not match. The archive documents the frustration inside the KGB. It shows how officers pushed industry to improve. It shows how political leaders demanded results. It shows how scientific limitations created internal pressure. In foreign regions, the Soviet Union expanded support for friendly governments and revolutionary movements. Africa became a major target. Newly independent states emerged across the continent. Many faced instability. Some leaned toward socialism. Some resisted Western influence. The KGB attempted to shape outcomes. It provided training to security services. It sent advisors. It offered intelligence. It helped build internal surveillance systems. Mitrokhin's papers include material on these operations. They show the complexity of working in regions with diverse political cultures. Asia was another major front. The Soviet Union supported movements aligned with its interests. It monitored China closely. Relations between Moscow and Beijing deteriorated. The split between the two nations created strategic challenges. The KGB tracked Chinese military development. It monitored political factions. It studied foreign alliances. The archive contains assessments of this rivalry. It shows how officers interpreted Chinese actions. It shows how they advised the Soviet leadership. Latin America also became a key battleground. The Cuban Revolution had a profound effect on Soviet strategy. It brought a socialist government into the Western Hemisphere. It challenged U.S. dominance in the region. It created opportunities for Soviet influence. The KGB supported Cuban intelligence services. It helped build their capabilities. It used Cuba as a base for regional operations. Mitrokhin's material includes files related to this cooperation. They show how intelligence information moved between Moscow and Havana. The Cuban Missile Crisis marked a turning point. It demonstrated the risk of nuclear confrontation. It revealed the limitations of Soviet capabilities. It showed the importance of intelligence assessments. After the crisis, the KGB increased its focus on understanding U.S. decision-making. It sought to identify signals of escalation. It studied diplomatic communications. It monitored military deployments. It examined patterns of presidential behavior. The archive contains reports dedicated to these efforts. During the 1960s and 1970s, social movements in the West gained strength. Civil rights movements grew. Anti-war protests spread. Cultural changes accelerated. The KGB believed these developments showed the instability of Western capitalism. It attempted to influence public debate. It used front groups. It spread narratives through sympathetic channels. It provided support to individuals who aligned with Soviet views. The archive reveals how these operations were planned. It reveals how they were carried out. It reveals the internal belief that society in the West was undergoing fundamental change. The KGB also faced challenges from Western counterintelligence. The CIA, FBI, MI5, MI6, and other services increased their efforts to detect Soviet operations. They monitored diplomats. They watched for clandestine meetings. They conducted surveillance. They ran double agents. They analyzed communications. They studied patterns of behavior. The KGB adapted. It developed more sophisticated methods. It improved communication security. It trained officers in counter-surveillance techniques. The archive shows how the KGB responded to Western pressure. It shows how it evaluated counterintelligence risks. Some Soviet operations were compromised, some officers defected, some networks collapsed. The archive includes files on these failures. It reveals the internal reaction. It shows how leadership interpreted these events. It shows how they attempted to prevent more failures. It shows how blame was assigned. These documents illustrate the culture inside the KGB. They show how fear shaped decision-making. They show how the agency dealt with internal weakness. Despite setbacks, the KGB maintained a global presence. It operated in Europe, Asia, Africa, and Latin America. It penetrated institutions. It influenced political movements. It conducted scientific espionage. It ran active measures. It monitored global events. It produced analyses that shaped Soviet foreign policy. Mitrokhin's work preserved the records of these activities. His archive offers a unified view of a far-reaching intelligence system. As the Cold War moved into the late 1970s, new factors emerged. Economic difficulties increased inside the Soviet Union. Leadership stability weakened. Technological gaps widened. Public dissatisfaction grew. The KGB responded by tightening internal control. It increased surveillance. It monitored more individuals. It tracked more conversations. It targeted dissidents more aggressively. It expanded its role in managing domestic stability. The archive shows the expansion of internal operations. It shows how officers viewed dissent. It shows how ideological concerns shaped internal policy. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 created new challenges. The conflict demanded intelligence resources. It required analysis of regional dynamics. It required support for military operations. It required monitoring of foreign involvement. The KGB worked closely with the military. It monitored resistance groups. It tracked supply routes. It analyzed the political consequences. The archive contains material on these efforts. It provides insight into how the KGB viewed the conflict. It shows how officers assessed the risks. It shows how they evaluated the global reaction. The 1980s brought further strain. The United States increased defense spending. It developed new weapon systems. It advanced technology. It applied economic pressure. The KGB monitored these developments. It reported to the Soviet leadership. It warned of perceived threats. It evaluated Western political shifts. The archive includes assessments of U.S. policy. It shows how officers interpreted American actions. It shows how they attempted to predict outcomes. Inside the Soviet Union, political and economic problems continued to deepen. Leadership transitions created uncertainty. The KGB attempted to manage this instability. It tracked public mood. It monitored elite opinion. It studied economic indicators. It assessed regional grievances. It attempted to predict potential unrest. Mitrokhin's archive includes internal evaluations. It shows how officers interpreted these trends. It shows the increasing anxiety inside the organization.